Hello, how you doing? So, we've got a pig heart in front of us here, and this is of similar size to what a human heart would be. In fact, sometimes pig heart valves are used in surgery. These implants can be used to help repair hearts for people. One thing that you want to be able to do when you first look at a heart is to be able to orient it, to be able to know where front and back is. And one real obvious thing is this structure right here. Do you see that there's this vessel that comes up and kind of goes out diagonally? When you look over here, you don't see that, and things look kind of a bit more floppy. There's veins that are coming in here on the back, and this is an artery. You might think that's the aorta. It actually is not. That's called the pulmonary trunk. The aorta kind of comes out the middle of the heart. But before we get to the vessels, let's take a look at some other structures. And with this is the front of the heart. And you can see this kind of floppy thing I can lift up. That's an auricle. And that is part of the atrium. There is more to the atrium than just the auricle. But here on the exterior of the heart, the auricles are pretty obvious. And then when we take a look at the heart interior, you'll see more of the atria. Then I'm just going to turn the heart a little bit over here. And do you see this now? This is another thing that I'm lifting up. That's another auricle. And so there's going to be a left and a right here. And this is the left auricle. You have to think of this being the front and this belonging to a pig. And if you're looking down on a pig, this would be their left side and this would be their right side. Okay, so right auricle, left auricle. And that means for here with the left auricle, that's where blood is returning to the heart from the lungs. So this would be having oxygenated blood. And then this, it would be where venous blood is first entering the heart. And so deoxygenated blood there on the right. Okay, let's take a look at some other kinds of things here. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Maybe that's too much, huh? And you can see that there are some vessels here. And these are branches of coronary vessels. Now, there's no staining, so we don't, you can't really easily tell between arteries and veins. So I just call them generically coronary vessels. I'm going to draw back a little bit. Now, there are some features of the heart that you can see on the exterior. There's two things that we call sulci, which are kind of like grooves along the heart. Right along here, where I pointed out some of those coronary vessels, there's the interventricular sulcus. And then here, kind of underneath where the auricles are, and I'm going to turn the heart over. And all along here, there's a groove. And here's the right auricle. We're looking at the back of the heart now, and so this is the right auricle here. And there's a lot of fat along here as well. Do you see all that white fat? And so that helps to be an insulating band. This sulcus is called the coronary sulcus. The big coronary artery and veins, the ones that serve all these little vessels, they come in here and then branches come off of them. Um, that's also called the atrioventricular sulcus because it separates the atria from the ventricles. And that ends up being important when we talk about heart conduction. And I'll talk about that in lecture. When you take a look at the heart, this bottom part of the heart that comes to a point, that's actually called the apex. We usually think about the apex as being the top of something, like top of a mountain. But here at this kind of bottom pointy part, that's the apex of the heart, and the base of the heart is here. All right, and what I'm going to do here is take a look at some of these vessels that you can see on the exterior of the heart. And I'll take you back to that vessel I had told you about a little bit earlier. This is a big artery, this one that kind of makes the front of the heart distinctive. This is the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk will divide into two pulmonary arteries. Then, see that there is this kind of big thing that I can lift up, and I'm going to turn it, and you can see this. And I can poke my probe down into it, and it goes down into the middle of the heart. This happens to have a little tiny branch off of it. You don't need to know the names of these little branches that are coming off, but this big opening here, that's the aorta. And you'll notice that the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, are very thick-walled. And so these are arteries that have a lot of thickness to them, and that's in comparison to the veins that you'll see are thinner walled and they collapse more easily. Here, these are staying open just with their own structure. So there's that, the artery, and then again, the pulmonary trunk. Now, let's turn it over and try to find some veins. And one way that you can confirm what a vein is where is it coming from? And that just uses some investigation with your probe, and you kind of can poke open some of these vessels here, and I'm going to put my probe into this. It actually passes all the way through like this. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Okay. So this vessel is on the back of the heart, and then you can see this, our flappy structure. We know that's an auricle. This is the back of the heart. We know this is the right auricle. And then when you kind of poke with the probe, you can see that this vein is attached to this auricle. So it is blood is coming through this vein and entering into the right auricle. Can you tell what that is then? Yeah, it's the vena cava. And since there is this part and this part, there is the superior vena cava, and this is the inferior vena cava. Now I'm going to use some other hearts just because there always is a variety in what these hearts look like and what these vessels look like, depending on how they cut the heart when it was being processed. These are a product of the pork industry, and so once the pig has been slaughtered, they do things like this, like remove the heart, and they just kind of cut it in different ways. And sometimes the vessels are long and sometimes they're short. These are kind of short. But I'll show you another one where things are a little bit longer. But let's proceed and try to find some other vessels. Now, if I poke into here, or I poke into here, I think, yeah. So I'm taking a look on the back of this heart, and I can put my probe into here, and I could put my probe into here, this or this. And when it is going in, it is kind of poking into the left auricle. All right? So these are two floppy vessels that are attached to the left auricle. And actually, just the fact that they're attached to an auricle, that alone tells you that it's a vein. Blood is entering into auricles. Blood does not exit out of auricles or atria. So this blood would be entering in and going into the left atrium. And we can see the auricle real plainly here on the outside. So then what's that? Yeah, that's the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein, and there's two of them. These are the very large entry vessels, coming from each of the lungs. So there'd be a left and a right lung, and they each have a pulmonary vein, and they're going to be both headed to this left atrium. Okay? So one other thing, and it doesn't look so good in this heart, is to look for then pulmonary arteries. The blood that's leaving the heart and going to the lungs, out the pulmonary trunk. So the pulmonary trunk, and this is what I am poking my probe into right here, and you can confirm it. I'll just turn the heart around. You see this? Pulmonary trunk. There it is. But here, this one has been cut down pretty short. So if there was more, they didn't cut it so short, then you could see two smaller arteries, and those would each be called pulmonary arteries. But I'll get another heart that has more on it. I think it's actually good to first look at stuff, especially the aorta, when there's not so much on it. This is the aorta again, by the way. Going right out the middle heart. See that? I'm going to turn the heart around. Coming right out of the middle of the heart. Makes sense, right? The blood that comes out of the aorta is going to the systemic. It's under much higher pressure than the blood that's coming from the right ventricle, and it's the left ventricle has a lot of thickness of the muscle walls to it, and it's right there in the middle of the heart. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop right there, and then we'll get into the interior of the heart in a little bit. All right, welcome back. And hey, you want to take a look on the interior of the heart? Let's do that. One thing I'll mention before we do the interior is that there's some layering to the heart. There actually is some epithelial tissue along with all of that muscle tissue that makes up most of the heart. Your heart is pretty much just mostly muscle. But there is this thin epicardium that kind of makes the heart shiny. So there's that thin layer of epicardium. And then when you take a look on the interior of the heart, there is this shininess where you find the ventricles and the other chamber that's shiny too, and that's called endocardium. But yeah, I've opened up to the interior of the heart, and you might be surprised that it doesn't look like there's big chambers in here. It just looks like mostly muscle and these little furrows. going to turn it over, and you do indeed see a bit more of a chamber-like look here, but there's still a lot of muscle. And the two ventricles are here and here. Quite different maybe than what you thought. This one here, this one that's the main one that seems to be right there in the middle of the heart, is the left ventricle. And indeed, this is going to be pumping blood out the aorta and coming out of the middle of the heart. So this is right ventricle here. The right ventricle, it's hard to just have a single slice and get a good sense of the right ventricle. It really kind of curves around the side of the heart, and so you only get a little bit of a glimpse of it with a single cut. I can turn things over here, and you can see more here, gazing into part of the ventricle here. This is a valve that I'll point out in a second. And this is more of that ventricle. So we kind of got it, we cut into it, and then we're seeing little windows into it. But let's first look at some structures associated with this area of the heart. This is the interventricular septum. This is a bit, it's usually not all that wide. There's a little bit of muscle that's kind of extending over here. I could cut that off, but this is that septum that divides the two ventricles. And then, again, this is the left ventricle. When you kind of pull open the ventricle, you can see some various aspects to it. You know what? I'm going to stop the video here. I'm going to cut this off, and then I'll rejoin you. All right. So now we're looking back in, and I've kind of propped things open so that things kind of stay open. And one thing that you'll notice when you take a look at the walls of the ventricles is that they aren't as smooth as you might think, that there's little pockets and furrows within the walls of the ventricles. And those little furrows, those little grooves in the walls of the ventricles are called trabeculae carnae, which is complicated to spell, but I'll show it here. Then you might notice these little strings here. And those will go up here to the this flappy structure. And so when you, since you know that we're here in the left ventricle, you can probably start to figure things out here. Now, this flappy structure is one of the AV valves. And so this is the bicuspid valve. It's also called the mitral valve. And then these strings are called chordae tendineae, which is also spelled a little weird. And the chordae tendineae are attached to, do you see how the muscle kind of makes a big bump here? I'm going to zoom in. All right. Do you see there's kind of this big bump of muscle, and I'm kind of shifting back and forth? That's called papillary muscle. This is also some too. Shift up. That you can see this bump here. So papillary muscle, and the chordae tendineae go into them. And when the ventricle contracts, the papillary muscles also contract, and they pull down on the chordae tendineae, and they make sure that this mitral valve stays in its shape so that it doesn't flip inside out. This is a lot of pressure. This is the most blood pressure your body will experience, is right in here at this left ventricle. And so there'll be A lot of pressure coming up this way to possibly escape out the atria. When you're on the superior side of this flap here, you're in the atria. That's the left atria. And so to prevent regurgitation, that's why you have these valves. And then, so instead of going here, the blood will be shunted to go here. And I think maybe I'll turn the heart a little bit and allow you to be able to see this. And I'll zoom in. So the blood would be coming in here, and then there's these three flappy structures. See this? Ding, ding, ding. Those are all collectively the semilunar valve. It's called the aortic semilunar valve, or sometimes it's just called the aortic valve. And then that prevents backflow for once blood goes into the aorta, and then the heart goes into diastole. That blood doesn't go backwards that way. You don't want it coming backwards into the ventricle once you squished it out. Then to take a look at some of the structures then on the right ventricle, I'm going to zoom out again. That you might think is a chordae tendineae. Do you see this? I'm spreading apart the right ventricle. I'm going to hold it open. I'm going to zoom in too. All right. So that's called the moderator band. That's a neat name. The moderator band helps with two things. It helps with conduction so that electrical signals can quickly jump over here and spread down to the ventricles. It also can kind of help the things from getting too distended here. Now, it's hard to be able to see the tricuspid valve here, but it is right here. The chordae tendineae kind of give it away. And then you look for a flappy structure that's attached to that. So that's the AV valve for the right side, the tricuspid valve. And then, and here it is again. So it's all the way kind of up into this space that you get into the atria, so that you're superior, you're above where that AV valve is. There is these flaps here of the tricuspid valve, the chordae tendineae coming from them. And then if you look superiorly, just past where this valve is, then you're going backwards into the atrium. And so here are the walls of the atrium that I'm kind of brushing up against here. And then you can see that it has a lot of grooves, little valleys and bumps along it. And here, where it looks kind of like tree roots, if I just kind of really spread it out and push it at you, it looks like that. And these muscles that are raised are called pectinate muscles. So there's those pectinate muscles. Ligamentum arteriosum. And it can be a bit tricky to find. You would typically dissect a bit in order to be able to find this kind of tough structure that connects the aorta to the pulmonary trunk. And you might think, well, why would you want to connect between them? That's oxygenated and deoxygenated blood coming together. Now, this ligamentum arteriosum actually doesn't allow blood to go between them, but it's a remnant left over from fetal circulation. And indeed, you do have some crossover at that point. Now, this aorta is cut down lower than that heart that I had shown you before, so that's a little bit of variety. That's cut lower. You don't, well, you see one branch that comes before that, but the big opening here is the aorta. And then to turn over here, and we're seeing all this kind of floppy stuff on the back of the heart, and you might notice that you kind of see this big gaping hole. This was cut really low next to this left atrium, so you don't really get to see pulmonary veins going in here. You just see this big gaping hole. Sometimes you run across that. Now, you are able to see pulmonary arteries in this heart. This and this are each pulmonary arteries. And you can confirm that. You kind of poke this in. Oh, actually, okay, I'm going to correct myself because now that I've investigated, this is actually a pulmonary vein right here. It goes into this. It goes into this big gash where the left atrium is. This thicker walled one, and there needs to be one somewhere else, is a pulmonary artery. Ah, here it is. See this? So this guy and this guy. See how it's important to kind of poke and investigate? So this and this are each pulmonary arteries. And this is our pulmonary vein over here going into the left atrium. But this guy and this guy, they both meet up in the pulmonary trunk. See how I'm kind of pushing that around from the inside? That's because my probe has gone in through the pulmonary artery to go backwards into the pulmonary trunk. And I'll also show on the back of this heart too that there's a little bit more of the superior vena cava. This is superior vena cava, kind of poking it down in here, pokes out this way. You can always kind of do that with a probe. With the vena cava, you can just, it ends up being slanted like this next to the right atria. So that's superior vena cava. The inferior vena cava does not look all that great though. Now, this heart is pretty good at being able to show you another interesting structure that is sort of a remnant. It's kind of a sealed over structure that ended up being important in fetal circulation. So just like our ligamentum arteriosum is something that you see in an adult, but it used to be a passageway called the ductus arteriosus in fetal circulation. Here, what you want to do is you kind of look at where this inferior vena cava is, and that is entering into the right atria. So this side of things is right atria, and this big gash, this side of things, this is the left atria. So left atria, right atria. They're really close together right here. And I'm going to poke my finger on the side of where the left atria is. I kind of poke it through, and I can see this thin wall. And I think this is something that you can kind of feel, maybe more than see, although you certainly can see it here, right? I'm going to zoom in. But I think the fact that it's thin is something that you can feel. And then you can feel what the sides of the atria feel like in other areas, and then how this one area here is different and thin. And you can poke around in the right atria too. feel what the walls are like, and then notice that this is another thin spot. So this is called the Fossa Ovalis. Fossa Ovalis. And this is a place that has sealed over and used to be a passageway between the left and right atria for fetal circulation. But it seals over in adults, and that's what we see here. And then just to take a look again at some more variety. This is the last one I'll use, but yeah, these pig hearts get cut in different ways, and so they end up being different. So it's good to come in and take a look at this variety, and I'm giving a sense of it to you. Again, I can kind of poke in, and you get to see that slant of where the vena cava is. This is superior vena cava. This is inferior vena cava. And then zooming in, so here's inferior vena cava again. Then there's this here, there's this. So different places to poke in. This one I'm poking in is going into the left auricle, so that tells you it's a pulmonary vein. This one is going into the pulmonary trunk there, in the front of the heart. So pulmonary trunk, and this was poking into that. So pulmonary artery, this pokes into that same place. So pulmonary artery, pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, and this is inferior vena cava. And so that's another look at what these vessels in the back are like. I think sometimes those are trickier. Now, I've told you about 3 valves, but we know that there's 4 valves. So what about this 4th valve? It's going to be another semilunar valve. It's the pulmonary semilunar valve. And you have to make a different cut in order to be able to see it. It's right here at the base of the pulmonary trunk. And so what we often do is just kind of take our cut, bring it over to the base of the pulmonary trunk. And you can see here, this is the interior to the ventricle, the right ventricle. Oh, here's a big moderator band, by the way. Yay. And you can see all those furrows of the trabeculae carnae there. Okay, but let's get to the valve. And it's right in here. I'm going to zoom in. And there, you see that there's a flappy thing right here. There's a cluster of 3 flaps. Okay, there. This guy, and this guy. So there's these 3 flaps together, and they go into the pulmonary trunk. There's our pulmonary trunk. So there's the valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve.